Hello, everyone, wherever you are on the globe, and welcome to this 18th edition of the International Conference on the Quality of Education. This year's theme is the main determinants of improving learning outcomes, analysis of PISA, TEAMS, and PEARS data. The conference aims to determine the obstacles and levels of academic success by analyzing the variables having an influence on learning outcomes in education systems throughout the world. The main objectives of the conference are understanding the factors that impact learning outcomes, identification of the main effects, proposal of scenarios to improve the quality of education system. Papers to be presented should allow to achieve these goals. During 15 days, you will have the pleasure to follow online policymakers, researchers, and experts from 21 countries and 5 continents. The presentations will be divided into 8 sessions, and in each session, you will be able to chat with the guests by asking them questions live on Facebook, Meta, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Today, I have the pleasure, me Abdel Nasser Naji, the president of Amaken, to announce the opening of Symposium 18. The opening session will be composed of 2 parts. The first, this one, will be devoted to an internationally renowned researcher in large-scale assessments. The second, at 5 p.m., will be reserved to policymakers, also of international renown. Senior advisor and honorary member of International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, which is the lead of TEAMS, PEARS, and was executive director of this institution during 17 years. It is therefore my great pleasure to welcome Mr. Hans Weijmaker. Hello, Hans.
Good morning, Najee. It's Abnasa. It's a pleasure to be here this morning or evening.
Thank you so much, Hans, for accepting our invitation. Today is a great opportunity to open a deep debate with you on the large scale assessments. The first question to you: what are the main characteristics of a large scale assessment?
Well, I guess I would address my comments to the international form of large-scale assessments. And for us, they have always been collaborative assessments of learning outcomes, high quality. And I think that's a key characteristic, that this is not about an institution imposing a set of instruments on a group of participants, but rather it's a coming together of experts from around the world who contribute to the form and shape and execution of the assessment. Typically, they have a key subject matter focus, the foundational skills of reading, mathematics, science, but they also include civic education and technology. And in the early history of IEA, at least, they included assessments in language. The OECD, of course, does some work with in TALIS and in early childhood. Now, one of the key features of the international large-scale assessments there is that they're designed to provide population estimates, national, regional, international, as opposed to focusing on the learning achievement of individual students. They work around a common test that's administered at the same time in the school year, irrespective of whether or not countries' timetables conform to a northern or southern hemisphere timetable. And the idea behind this is to ensure that at the time of the assessment, students have experienced similar amounts of schooling in the subject area of interest. Not surprisingly, they have a common definition of the dependent variable. And one of the first tasks in the creation of an assessment framework is to come up with a definition of the variables. In order to achieve wide and deep understanding of student performance in a subject area, and to avoid the need to assess every student, they employ multiple matrix sampling. So students are sampled as well as the material in the domains of, say, for example, mathematics. This has the additional benefit also of allowing the reporting of subdomains, subject matter subdomains, as well as the cognitive domains. So we get a much better understanding of what is occurring in learning. And what's characteristic of the modern version of the large-scale assessments, say since the late 1980s, is that they're designed as trend studies. And that's a strategy which requires the retention of a proportion of items securely, which are then used to link to subsequent forms of the assessment. Accompanying the measures of the learning outcomes, their assessments have an associated model of learning, which includes particular variables of interest that can form strategic policy development. These vary to a certain extent by assessment simply because of the nature of the subject matter, but they would apply to civic education, mathematics, science, reading, technology equally well. They also work on a common methodology. This is to ensure that at the end of the process, we come up with a high quality assessment where we can reliably make comparisons among participating countries. And perhaps I think one thing that may not be quite as obvious is that the assessments are continually evolving. For those people who have participated with the TIMSS and PEARLS assessment will have seen their transformation from paper and pencil based assessments to computer based. We will see the use of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, or at least the beginnings of that, looking at log file analysis to help us understand the strategies that students may employ in answering questions, and so forth. And we expect that over time, this will continue. The other areas, of course, is adaptive testing, where instead of students either asking each question of the test, they are filtered through the assessment in a way which allows them to best demonstrate their skills and understanding.
Excellent. Many characteristics of large-scale assessment, but what are the essential advantages of a large-scale assessment and differences between it and the student assessment done normally by teachers?
Well, of course, they serve different purposes normally. The biggest advantage in some ways of large-scale assessment is that it relies on a sample, a national probability sample, and it doesn't require a census of all students. But this doesn't allow you to provide good estimates of individual student achievement, and it's not designed to do that. Teacher assessments, on the other hand, typically look at the progress that students are making in a classroom, and they do this in a way by looking at learning outcomes, assessment of learning or assessment for learning as a guide to instruction. The timing, the periodicity of these things is obviously quite different. Large-scale assessments are longer term. They typically take 3, 4, or 5 years to develop and administer and report, whereas classroom-based assessments can be very immediate. Teachers in classrooms typically use a classical model for analyzing the data. Percentage is correct. Whereas because of the design of the large-scale assessments, multiple matrix sampling, RASH methodologies are used where they look at the relationship between student ability and item difficulty in terms of understanding performance. Now, some people ask, why can't we just take classroom assessments and run them across all the kids, so the grade level within a school, and then run and aggregate them up? The difficulty with that is, of course, is that the scoring may not be standardized, the administration may not be standardized, and there's a risk of introducing measurement error. So the efficiency is one of the big things that large-scale assessments can contribute.
Several countries participate in TEAMS, PEARLS, and PISA, but without really learning from them. How can policymakers take benefits through large-scale assessments?
Well, I think this is an important question. I think one of the key things is that this has got to be a purposeful activity, that it requires engagement right from the very beginning in terms of deciding, for example, what the sample for a country will be. IA and provides a template which outlines what every country must do. But within that template, or within the boundaries of that template, there's an opportunity for countries to modify the design in such a way that they can pursue populations of interest within a country. There's an opportunity within some limits to include variables that may be of particular interest to a country or to a region. There are a number of countries, including Australia, Canada, where with a federal system, there's an opportunity, for example, where the states could get together and decide that here's an area that's of common interest to us, and the opportunity of PEARLS or TIMS provides us with a chance to pursue that issue just for ourselves. The international assessments, the way that designed, provide important insights, I think, into several levels, whether it's curriculum, where you could look at the different strengths and weaknesses within the country. You could identify gaps compared to what is perceived to be the international benchmark in terms of what students should learn at the end of grade 4 or grade 8, for example. But it can also look at how instruction is executed within a country and how that differs across the world. Is there a way of pursuing the teaching of mathematics and science in other countries that could inform local practice. There's a question about resourcing. That's a number of the questions about resourcing in school management and how they are related to learning outcomes and whether or not there are policy issues that can be addressed within a country. There's also the question of outside influences, and one of the, I think, real benefits of the IEA design is the fact that we have a parent questionnaire, and successive assessments in the area of reading in particular have demonstrated the important role that parents play in the acquisition of reading skills with very young children. And this is raises the question as to whether or not there's an approach within the country where where you devote resources or efforts to encourage parents to work with their kids. And I guess there are also important questions raised about equity and efficiency. How do the outcomes look in terms of the performance between gender or ethnic groups? Does the system move students of all backgrounds through the system to higher levels of achievement in minimal time, or in an equitable fashion, basically? And I think these are fundamental questions that most educators would be interested in.
Excellent. The IEA was the developer of TEAMS and PEARLS, and the OECD initiated in 2000 PISA. What differences between PISA, TEAMS, and PEARLS, especially concerning methodology?
I think there are some major differences, and while there are commonalities, including the use of rash technologies and probability samples, but I think one of the fundamental ones, is the fact that IEA has a underlying curriculum model. So the assessments are curriculum based. We look at what students learn and can do after a fixed period of schooling. And this drives a sampling strategy, which is classroom based. So we take intact classrooms. PISA, on the other hand, samples individual students. This assessment was originally designed as a yield model, looking at the learning outcomes for 15-year-olds. So PISA targets 15-year-olds, which is an age-based model. The challenges or the differences are such that 15-year-olds are not distributed, are distributed across multiple grades for most countries, and particularly when you get into countries that are in earlier stages of development in terms of their educational systems. We know from the research that students who are in the higher grades do better. So that if you have different proportions of students across countries in the higher grades, the average scores are affected simply by the effect of, for example, one country having 90% of students in grade 10 and another country having 60% in grade 10. So this, in terms of interpretation, some care needs to be taken. So the curriculum design for TIMSS and PEARLS also means that we look at what policy dictates in terms of expectations, curricular expectations, what the teachers do in terms of implementing the curriculum, and what students can demonstrate in terms of achieving the curriculum. The two models also work on different cycles. PISA operates on a 3-year cycle where they administer all three tests for all three subjects in the same year, giving emphasis to math, science, or reading in different years. So every 9 years, you have the same domain as the major domain. TIMSS, on the other hand, is a 4-year cycle. And it's designed in such a way that if you participate in grades 4 and grade 8, and on those occasions where we administer a grade 12 test, you can actually follow sort of synthetic cohorts over successive cycles. So after assessing grade 4, one cycle, they become grade 8 4 years later, and so on. And so in addition to looking at trends over time in absolute sense, you can also look at the changes in performance between grade 4 and grade 8 and grade 8 and grade 12. The other main difference, I would say, is that TIMSS and PIRLS both allow teacher-student linkages. So you can observe and examine some of the classroom processes in a way that is obscured in PISA because there is no linkage between teachers and students. Their students are over several grades, and it's not a simple matter to then link students back to their teachers. TIMSS and PIRLS also gather data from parents, and I think this has provided us with some very powerful insights into the home environment and the home learning environment and its relationship to learning outcomes. For me, it's always been striking that in every country where parents are involved with their children's reading, students do better. TIMSS has also demonstrated similar sorts of relationships. And of course, there are other questions that we can address to parents that we can't address to students. And finally, well, it's implied in some of the answers I've already given, but we have different target populations. We have an age-based versus a grade-based strategy. And I think these are major design differences that allow us to do quite different things. TIMSS and PIRLS participants are younger than PISA, where the focus is on 15-year-olds. PIRLS is designed in a way to look at a key transition point, particularly for reading, where in most countries, students are beginning to move from learning to read to reading to learn. The argument being that if you have not acquired the skills, the reading skills by the end of grade 4, students will begin to struggle with acquiring knowledge in the other subject matter areas at a later age. If I think I mentioned to you earlier on that for those people who are interested, last year I published with colleagues a book with Springer, Open Access, and I'll wave it at you, but it's available as an open access volume. If you go to Springer link and type in my name, it's free. You can choose to download the whole volume or those particular chapters which are of interest to you for free.
Well, several countries Several countries do large-scale assessments at the national level. Can each country use this methodology to make national large-scale assessments?
Yes, in fact, as many people will be aware, that the methodology that's been developed for TIMSS and PEARLS and the OECD is used in the National Assessment of Educational Progress in the United States. It's been modified to address the complexity of international comparative assessments, but many of the underlying methodological techniques were first developed in NAEP. In Central Europe, not long after IEA began to expand its TIMSS assessment, a number of countries began to adopt aspects of the international methodology for their national assessments. And most recently, IEA has been working with Botswana, who is just beginning to implement a national assessment, initially in mathematics, based on TIMSS, and IEA is working with them to do that. So yes, the technology is accessible, it's available, and it is being used in other countries.
TIMSS and PEARLS and PISA are used for secondary education and primary education. How to use large-scale assessment in higher education?
Higher education presents some interesting challenges, of course. We have institutions that are autonomous. We have students who are also autonomous in a much more so than students who are required to be present in primary and secondary education. But also we don't have a nationally specified curriculum in the same way that you would find for mathematics at the secondary or primary level, for example. Having said that, IEA has successfully run a international comparative study of the learning of mathematics teachers, and it did present some of the challenges that I've just outlined, but it was possible. And I could think of other subject matter areas where, particularly at the end of I don't know, say, for example, a program in perhaps law. One could think that there must be some common elements of law programs that would apply equally in all universities that students should know. Securing cooperation, of course, is both from the institutions and from students would be a major challenge, particularly if neither the institution or the student would see a benefit. I think they could be made to, benefits could be described and identified in a way which might make it possible. But as I say, we were able to do something successful with mathematics teachers.
Thank you, Hans. We have questions from participants, and please answer few.
Sure, gladly.
What should developing countries do to reduce the learning outcomes gap with developed countries?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, one of the things about the international assessments there are always two stories. There are the international outcomes where you typically see the comparison of performance among countries and the benchmark performance in subdomains, for example. However, there's also always a national story, and the challenge, I think, for participating countries, particularly developing countries, is to look and come to understand the local circumstances and those variables which make a difference in that country in terms of the possibility of improving learning outcomes. One example I can think of is a number of years ago, we were looking at the influence of teacher preparation on learning outcomes. And in many countries, you will see there is very little effect. And part of it is because it's not that it's not important, quite the opposite. It's that in many of the developed world, teachers have achieved a high standard of training and education. There's very little variance, and without any variance, it's very difficult to look at the effect on learning. So a few years ago, I was looking at a report. In this case, it was Botswana again, and they did a great job of looking at the differences in student performance dependent on the preparation of their teachers. And that showed quite considerable effects of even one extra year of teacher preparation on the performance of students. So coming, to understand the nuance of a country is what can begin to provide guidance to policy development. There are other issues, of course. There are many things that we can learn from other countries. They have to do with the rigor of the curriculum. Of course, depends on teachers who can teach it. But it also means that there may be identifiable gaps in curricular provision that can be addressed without a huge amount of interest of time. I'm afraid, after we've worked with this for a long time, there are no simple answers. Otherwise, we would probably have found them. But it's really doing the work to coming to understand national data and taking the opportunity that's presented by the international assessments and beginning to prepare for subsequent cycles and saying, okay, we learned this in 1995. We have a new cycle coming in, this is not 1999, I'm just going back. What other questions should we be asking? What other consideration should we be giving to our sampling design to come and understand something more about the differences in performance among some of our subgroups? Are there urban-rural differences? Are there differences between boys and girls that we need to address? And the one thing I would always say is that every country you can find things to celebrate. There are always students who perform well. There are always schools that perform well. The challenge for a country is to come to understand how those schools and students that perform less well, how do they differ from those others that I've just mentioned? And it's taking the time to interrogate that data and work with it to inform policy.
Another question, Hans, is the lack of financial means a major obstacle to progress in the TEENS, PIRLS, and PISA assessments?
I think finances are always a challenge. I mean, it's particularly a challenge, I think, for, I hesitate to use less developed countries, but countries that are less economically advanced. There are also significant, and those challenges are by way of participation fees and the ability to resource the infrastructure necessary to carry out the assessments. But there are also challenges, I think, for the national centers and organizations like IAA, because these assessments need to evolve. And what you don't see is a huge amount of resource that's required, for example, to transform paper-based assessments into computer-based assessments, how to manage the translation in a more efficient way, how to meet the expectations of participants in either including new material. And that includes, given the advent of computer-based assessment, new forms of questions. And it just takes a lot of money. Yeah, it's always a challenge.
Okay, another question, so maybe the last. Teams, Pearls, and PISA provide great data on the factors that impact learning. Did the researchers work hard enough to exploit this international database?
Sorry, to explore this? Well, as you are probably aware, that I'll speak for IEA because I'm not as familiar with what the OECD does, but IEA puts a huge amount of effort into providing the training necessary for people to access their data and to explore it. We also run academies through our joint institute with the Educational Testing Service, where we focus on different topics from time to time in, for example, the more advanced areas of statistical analysis. But we also run and are prepared to run, bespoke training sessions for countries or for regions. And this has been done in the MENA region. It's been done in Canada for the Canadian provinces. We've done something like this in Asia. And I know that IA is open to any approach to assist countries or regions with the training necessary to allow them to interrogate the data further. One of the challenges for IA has always been that, our deliverable, our key deliverable is the international report, which can only go so far in terms of talking about countries. It's not possible for the IA researchers to know the country detail necessary to make an informed observation about what's happening in a country in terms of their education system. I know that many countries put a huge amount of work into a national report. And as an example, Botswana was an example that I've used before, but again, they did a very thorough job of saying, well, here's a set of data that we've never had before. What can we learn from it? And they spent a considerable amount of time and resource in trying to inform their local policy circumstance.
Thank you so much, Hans, for your participation in this first part at the opening session of SimCursif 18. And I hope we can welcome you another time, maybe in Morocco.
That would be my pleasure.
Thank you. Right. And you, dear viewers, do not forget the rest of our program today at 5 p.m. We will welcome Olli-Pekka Heinonen, former Minister of Education in Finland, and at 6:30 we will welcome Najat Vallaud Belkacem, former Minister of Education. See you later.